All right, so we'll go ahead and get going. So a slide that was asked to put in for our Trinug and our platinum sponsor, Cozy Rock. So a quick intro about me. So I work for a company called Metabolon. That's their website. I'm a principal software engineer there. I've been writing software professionally since 1997. I've done a lot of different things with software, and I didn't really have a mentor, so to speak. And so I'm hoping that some of this talk will be useful to you and what I learned along the way. But what I do over at Metabolon is I'm helping them with their software stack. The software that was there was in really bad shape when I got there, and we're trying to recreate it and reimagine it so it can be a lot easier to use, maintain, and also to extend into what analytics we'd like to do. We do metabolite testing, and so we take biologicals from something that was alive, and we take it in liquefied form, run it through a mass spectrometer, and then we get a signature of metabolites, and then we use those metabolites to try to shed light on what's going on with basically biology and life. Try to use that to improve our understanding of life sciences.
And Metabolon has a table.
I'm sorry? Yeah, we do have a table. That's a good point. If you haven't done it already, go ahead and drop by the table. We have a raffle for a Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigs of RAM. There's fields where you can fill in if you're interested in being contacted. If you're not, just put your name. If you're not present, you won't win. So, all right. So I wanted to start with a quick agenda. I'd like to start with your intentions. Why did you come here? What were you looking for? And then some definitions. And I thought, even though most people would probably have put the motivation higher than the definitions, I wanted to talk to like the motivations, like why would a talk like this be interesting for me to try to give, and what was I looking to try to do? And then kind of get into the principles that I'm basing this talk on. So the master principle, and then the sub principles, kind of breaking that down a little bit. And then I have some suggested swaps. And then I have a few cautionary tales, and if we have time, I'd love to have some question and answers. If, as I'm going along, there's something that I'm talking through, and then you have questions about that specifically, feel free to stop me. If you have a question that maybe the answer is more involved, I might ask that we defer it closer to the end, if that's right. All right, so does anybody want to share kind of what they were hoping to get when they came here and what they were looking for? Mark?
Well, I already consider myself a senior contributor, not just because this is not premature gray, but this, but also what you think is a senior contributor.
Okay. So
and how I might do things differently or better or whatnot from what I'm already doing.
Okay.
I was considering .NET and Azure, but this presentation sounds like it will enable me to learn those kind of things.
Okay. Try to streamline your learning processes. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, for me, I'm a pretty new developer, so looking to start good habits now that can pay off in the future.
Okay.
I'm an experienced developer who would like to know what a principal software engineer looks for in senior contributors.
Okay.
I was going to say just how to grow into that position.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Yeah, those are all good intentions. I hope I can cover each of them adequately, and if you don't feel I have by the end, please, ask me to more specifically talk about your question. So the definitions of what I was getting at, I figured it might be best, even though it might seem very basic, to make sure we're talking the same language. So as a contributor, I'm referring to a person or a thing that contributes something. right? So a senior, I'm more talking about the second one. So I think, to Mark's point, we could think about the first one, but
Oh, you have to be grown up?
come on. This one is kind of what authoritative is what I'm more referring to even than high. So like, why would people consider you someone that was a reference, right? Why would they go to you? Why would they be interested in valuing your opinion higher than maybe the next person, right? That might be one reason, and it certainly is one that a lot of people think of. But I'm actually hoping to provide you a frame that might allow you to feel like you can contribute potentially as someone who is maybe in the early stages of being senior before other people might recognize it, or kind of like build that pathway more quickly.
Are you going to address imposter syndrome as part of your presentation?
Yeah, right after, actually, I think there's a slide that I talk about something that might lead well into that question. And so if you remember this talk, I said how. And so what I'm hoping to do is to be a little bit prescriptive, is like, this is the path by which you would do it, and not necessarily like every single thing, but also not so high level that it's not useful to you at all, right? I've seen a lot of talks, you go there, your ears tickled, they tell you some funny jokes, and then you walk away, you had fun, but really you can't walk away with anything that changes you in a way that you would be able to notice. So like, I did go there, didn't go there, you were to compare those two versions of your life, and they would more or less be the same, right? So I'm hoping not to provide that experience for you today. So why would I be interested in giving this talk? So one reason I wanted to give this talk is that senior roles pay more. And that probably is not shocking to most of you. This is from payscale.com. These are average salaries. So I'm talking to multiple roles. I realize this is a developer conference, but I wanted to show that senior roles kind of transfer to other different markets, not just developer related markets. And so if you think of an accountant, an account manager, product marketing managers, the difference between a typical or a senior actually is a considerable sum of money. And the difference doesn't always have to be something that feels like, you just have to pay your dues and there's this, club and you break into it and then now I'm considered senior and I get this extra pay, right? But especially in the software developers, you can see like it's quite different. It's not just a little bit of money, it's actually a fair amount of money. So it's not just about the money though. I want to point out that the reason why I show the money is because this is what corporations value, right? So if you go to work for a company and you ask them, what would you spend money on it? And then they say, well, can you do it for free? The answer to that question is, I don't care about it, right? If you ask them about something and they say, well, I would pay $1 million to fix that, this is a valuable problem to them, right? And so that's kind of why I'm showing you that pay scale and talking about the money, is that you want to use the money not as just a drive to how you kind of think about and frame your life, but just as a little bit of a frame to help you understand what is your client value and let that kind of guide you a little bit. All right, so the other one is time. You can spend a lot of time online. And to Mark's question about imposter syndrome, there's a lot of folks that might wonder, am I a senior yet, right? Like, I worked in the field for a couple years or 3 years. At what number of years are you senior? And the real answer is that there's no fixed length of time to becoming senior. And that's an important thing to remember, because if there's no fixed length of time, then that means it's not waiting for something to happen. It's you need to try to put yourself in the right mindset, right? And that mindset will bias you to being basically a senior that's getting better over time, more like the way we think of ourselves as practicing software development, it's not like we've mastered it and we've gotten to the point that I'm the pinnacle of software development. You're practicing it. They do this for medicine, right? You don't like to think that the guy who's doing brain surgery on you is practicing medicine, but really he is. He doesn't know everything, and he's hoping to get better over time. And so in the same way, we want to be kind of doing this in the practice, but veined with the right context of what we want to do. So there's a lot of different references about what you can do to get better on a more discrete level, kind of different matrices, like you should know at least this level of technology at this spot. I actually think that those are disingenuous to the real problem of how to think about in the right frame, because knowledge, I don't think, is really the core problem. I think the core problem is how you apply your knowledge, kind of like the difference between being intelligent versus wise, right? I would encourage you to be wise more than intelligent. And I think that's going to be the key that gives you the ability to claim seniority in a situation where you may not be the most experienced person. All right. So the last reason I wanted to point out is why I was personally interested in doing this is I wanted to give back. When I had a very fortunate career to be in software development, to kind of get into this. I had a few places that I landed that I was able to do well. But I do know of other folks that they struggled because they didn't have a mentor. They didn't have a guide, or maybe the first place they landed, they treated them poorly, and it kind of left them with some kind of, you know, professional scars, if you will. And I don't want folks to have to go through that unnecessarily to get to the path of becoming senior and being rewarded if that's something that they're seeking. Now, if you're not interested in being a software developer, whatever field you're going into, I hope that you can kind of accelerate your career growth in something that is rewarding to you. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm hoping to provide here. And so the master principle I'm using to frame this is something that comes out of project management. And it's what a lot of people refer to as the project management triangle. And you may see in some talks, some developers that will actually kind of like jokingly talk about this. So you have the scope, you get the time, you get the cost, and then you got quality, right? And then the interesting part of this is that a lot of times people will say, well, you can have some of these, but you can't really have all of them, right? Well, maybe. I mean, there's a balance by which all of these come together, and it forms this triangle. But what I'm going to advocate to you is that what your managers and what your customers and what people that you are basically creating your value for, what they want is they want you to be seeking the same triangle that they want. Whatever it is that they're trying to get done, they want you to be trying to make the same trade-offs that they would make. Now, sometimes this is hard. Sometimes they don't know what the triangle looks like, and that's why they need your help. And I'll get to that. And so hopefully this creates a good frame for us. This project management triangle is talked about in more depth on this Wikipedia article, and I encourage you to go read about it. Taking a little snippet though, the discipline of project management is about providing the tools and techniques that enable the project team, not just the project manager. So this is where I think this is a key important thing. We're not trying to take over the project manager's role. We're trying to work in a situation, if we're not the project manager, that's in alignment with that role. So whatever it is that they're trying to do, whatever picture of the triangle they're trying to form, we're trying to make the same one that they are. That the goal is to try to get everybody to work towards the same trade-offs. So to organize their work and to meet these constraints. And so while this isn't really a talk on project management, basically my perception is that being senior boils down to being about helping your boss or client do more with less and of high quality. And that relationship is what you're trying to do. And I'll break each one of these down in a way that hopefully will make sense and allow you to kind of weigh your decisions wisely. So the first sub-principle I have here is around scope. So another way to think about scope would be, what is the coverage of features? So if you've ever been to a website that said you should buy our project or product because there's like this really long list of features that we have, and then they obviously show next to their product checkboxes by all of them, right? Well, this is what's meant by scope. It's like, how many different things does your whatever it is you're doing cover? Now, in order to do this, though, you really need to bring this in by understanding what it is that your stakeholders, and specifically if you have a manager or a client, what they value. Now, sometimes this can be challenging because your boss may be telling you to do the work, but the people who receive the value of your work might actually have a different notion of what the scope should be. So what do you do in those kinds of situations? Really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to help your boss succeed by creating the correct version of the triangle. So what you should do, if you know different, is not just argue with them. You should help everybody to see the same one, right? And that's what you want to do here for scope, is you would say, okay, well, this person wants this. My boss wants me to cut down on scope or maybe to increase it. But the right answer is I need to get everybody to see the same one. And once we all see the same one and agree, then we can move forward and everybody will be happy. Otherwise, one person will be unhappy at the expense of the other. And this basically is not really what your boss wants or your client wants. And part of that part about it is about valuing. Now, this valuing part is, I think, actually an interesting and challenging one. Valuing your clients' or your stakeholders' values, in my opinion, is about empathy. So empathy is this idea that you don't just understand the pain of someone else, you kind of almost can feel it in a real and sensible way, right? So the idea that, yeah, you did something, let's say there was an error in your program, or maybe you had some report that you delivered that had mistakes in it, and this mistake caused someone to have to stay late and work, and they missed their kids' soccer practice or something like that, or maybe a game. The fact that you understand and feel some of that pain, that shared pain, this is empathy. The idea that you know that there was a mistake and maybe they had to stay late and it's abstract and you don't feel any connection to their emotion, that is different. That's not the same as what I'm talking about. And so if knowing that these people, one of their goals is they want to go home at on time every day, then making sure that your changes, your value, your output allows them to do this, this is how you can succeed at doing that.
What happens if everyone in the team seems to have different types of goals or conflicting goals? Some developers just want to do the work, get back home, others want to refactor, rewrite the quality of the code also, and there's not a clear set of goals, standard set in the first place. This is what we should all work for. What do you do in that situation?
That's a great question, right? And I think that in that particular case, what you probably need as a team is basically to establish a statement of who are the stakeholders. Why did you show up for work, right? And if it's just for the money, I don't know about you, but like, you should change jobs. Like, that job sucks if you only show up for the money. Trading your money for your life is a bad trade. If you show up because you want to do something important, because you think that what you're doing is something that's going to change your life or someone else's life meaningfully, then you're doing the right job, right? It doesn't have to be something that gets paid millions of dollars.
Or if you like the work.
Yeah, if you enjoy
It
it.
doesn't matter that you're doing something beneficial, but if you like the work.
Well, if you are delivering value, right? Now you have to be clear, who are you delivering value for, right? And if it's just for you, you got to be clear that that's all you're going to get. And maybe you will never end up being senior as a result of that. And that if you're trying to get your team on a path to kind of thinking like a senior level contributor, getting them all on the same page of who is receiving the value is, I think, a critical component of that. And so if everybody's saying that my critical value is how I can benefit, then they're creating and receiving their own value. That's just a feedback loop, right? So I would say that's where I would start. is getting the team to really acknowledge what are they there for. And then to the point where they also would like to benefit. I mean, obviously you don't work nonstop just so that someone else can receive all the benefits. So how can we make this relationship good? And so then that's where you say, okay, well, what can we do so that we can deliver what they want and still get something that we want, which is going home on time, having, you know, clear requirements or whatever it is that they're seeking. And you ask that question together. It's a good question. So the other one is time. So sometimes when you're working on a project, something that will matter more is calendar days. Other time, what's going to matter more is person hours. So an example of that might be if you're working on something where maybe the project doesn't exist yet, then calendar days is going to be an example of something that's really critical. Now, in a case where person hours is going to matter a lot more, it's going to be, let's say your project already is out there and you being able to deliver something that reduces the total number of hours spent on any given task. This is going to be something that matters a lot more. Another example might be if you don't have a dedicated team or a resource that's perpetually going to work on something. This is where you'll need to make those kinds of conscious trades or those kinds of trade-offs. It's like how much time can I really allocate to this effort? The other thing to be aware of when you think about time is the opportunity window. I'm as guilty as the next guy of saying, I want to write software. That's awesome. It's like elegant. You look at it, it looks like a work of art. Like, how did someone figure out that this algorithm is so simple and so exactly what was needed, right? The problem is that doing that at the expense of the opportunity window basically takes all of that value and throws it in the trash. It'd be better to do something that was crap, but hit your opportunity window than something that was elegant that totally missed it. And now there's a few folks that they didn't hit a good balance, or maybe the folks that are trying to figure out the revenue streams didn't figure out like what to do to how to manage that. But this is why first to market is a real thing that people talk about as being potentially something that's devastating to who would be next, right? They have to be enough better that you being first can be disrupted. And so the opportunity window is one thing that when you're thinking about the time aspect of your triangle, you want to think about. And the last thing that I'll point out is this thing, and maybe I should have gotten a reference here because I put a little note to myself that I didn't apparently resolve, but future reward discounting. What I mean by this is that there's a notion, they've done studies on people. When you ask someone, would you rather have $20 today or $50 in a year? Almost everybody says, I'd rather have the 20 bucks now. How many of you get 150% interest on your money? Like, this doesn't happen, right? You just don't get that kind of interest. But if you waited a year, you'd get 150% interest. Well, this would be great. But if you die tomorrow, you won't have it, right? Or what if this person like goes away and you don't see them again, right? And so there's this notion that we have internally to ourselves that something that's too far away is worth less than today, right? Now, when we kind of get into the zone, go ahead.
Isn't that just my incorporating the factor of risk? You might not have $150, or you might not be there, or you might not remember saying it.
But it's even more like the way people internalize this notion and execute on it in like a real way is actually dramatically different than what a purely numerical version of it would end up panning out and playing out. So if you were to take someone who thought they were very analytical and you presented with these problems, they would choose something that showed an obvious like emotional bias as opposed to like a very logical and Spock-like bias. So it's not just about managing the risk. Because if it was just about managing the risk, you would do the risk in appropriate proportion to like stock market and other kinds of factors about what you would get. But like you wouldn't turn down 150% interest. So, and they've done interesting studies like this too, that, what is it? If you're interested in this particular topic, they call it like behavioral economics, or like there's books on that subject, and they kind of get into the details of different experiments that have been done, and what the outcomes of those experiments were. I think there was one that's fairly popular that was called Misbehaving, that's also on this subject, and it's a good read if you're interested. But the idea that something that's too far away isn't worth that much, be aware that your stakeholders and your people who are receiving your value, it's the same for them, right? So when you're doing something that's going to be much or amazingly better, depending on how far apart something versus that thing is, to them, it might not, like, it might seem like a fairy tale. It doesn't even exist, right? And so just be aware that this is something that is real and is part of the way people make decisions and value things. So this one here is on cost. So this would be the third point of the triangle. So you have different mechanisms that can be used to track costs. You've got money, contributor hours and effort, and required contributor level. So for example, maybe you could get something done, but then in order to maintain this project, you basically need to go out and hire some very experienced person. Well, if you can get it done and now to maintain the project, you don't need someone quite that experienced, this changes a little bit of that triangle, right? So this is part of the cost. This is the future side of that cost though. And then there's risks. And so you were asking about managing risks, right? In many ways, I think about a lot of the cost related metrics is basically around managing risk. So if you think about, there's a few books that talk about this where basically they take something, how do you know which investment to make, right? Where there's this much of a % chance that you could lose some money, and how much would you lose? And you know, what's the right decision to make? And if you're just making it just purely based on the numbers, you say, well, what's the expected amount that I would earn? And then what's the chance that, you know, I would lose it? And then you factor those in, and those risks basically become the expected earnings, including the risk, right? And but basically the risk allows you to make a decision. So if you say like the maximum upside on this is the program would be, I don't know, 25% faster, which might be good, but then the downside might be that, oh, it might take me, you know, a month to do it. Well, maybe it's not worth it, right? So you might rather have it slow. So there's different metrics by which cost can come, but the one that I like to think about as being one that is never renewable is the hours that you put into it. And I think it's important to remember that while you can get more money and you might be able to temporarily work harder and like all this kind of stuff, you don't ever get any more time. And so making the right decision on how many hours it takes from other people to make your thing work, I think is a very valuable aspect. And even though it feels like going back to the time thing, is a valuable aspect of how to frame the cost in. And so if you remember the triangle, in the middle of the triangle, we had quality. So quality, I think of as being the ability for you to say that this definitely will work, right? So you get done with something that you're working on, and if you do it really fast, how many of you have seen the how to draw a Spider-Man, and it has like 3 different amounts of time that they spend doing it? So there's a YouTube video, for those of you who haven't seen it, I probably should have linked it, it'd be cool. But there's a YouTube video where they draw a Spider-Man, and there's one of them where they spent, I don't know, I think it was like 6 minutes, and drew a nice Spider-Man, and when he got done, looked nice. And then what happens if you spend a minute? And then it kind of looked a little bit like a teenager did it. And then what happens if it's 6 seconds? Well, if it was 6 seconds, it looked like the guy didn't know how to draw at all. but the guy was a professional artist, right? But the reality is there's just only so much you can do in that time. And what he was trying to show is that if you don't invest anything, you just can't get the quality. It's just not possible. And the quality is going to be what allows you to know that it would be acceptable, right? There might be some instances where the 6-second version of that Spider-Man would have been perfectly okay. Like maybe if you're playing, I don't know, Pictionary or something, you're playing a game where you just drawing it on the paper, and folks just have to guess what you were drawing. But in a case where you're going to submit this and it's going to be part of an ad or something like that, maybe it's not acceptable, right? So putting in that extra effort, that quality, is what lets you know that they definitely will accept it. And the last one that I have here about claim versus reality, I also like to think about that quality is what allows you to make the assertion that when I say something is true, that it actually is true. Like this thing will reduce your company's expenditure on accounting because it's simpler. Like, is that true? Is it not true? Like, does it have bugs? How much time will I spend on the bugs? Like, decent quality software is going to be what allows you to actually come through on that statement. If someone says, I sold you a car and it goes from 0 to 60 in this many seconds and it has this much warranty and all that stuff, the fact that the car is well made is what allows you to really come through on all of those claims. And this is something I think that we need to be careful about. You know, it's easy to be in our silo in the cubicle and say, oh, well, the user just needs to learn how to use the software and then like things will be good, right? Well, that sensation is going to prevent someone from really making progress on coming through on the right claim and making that the same reality that they experienced. So I have some swaps, and you may have a bunch of swaps of your own. But what I'm suggesting with swaps is this idea that when you're going through your day, when you're going through your project, how can you change something that was a problem for someone else to solve to a problem that you solve, right? Realizing on, you know, I'm sure a lot of us have been in those like retrospective type meetings for Agile. How many of you been in retrospective meetings? How many of you feel like at the end of the retrospective meetings, all you ended up with was more complaints? Yeah. And then how many of you had the same complaint at the next retrospective meeting because you actually didn't solve it between that one and the next one, right? Yeah. It feels shameful when you actually say it, right? But one of the things that will help you to be seen as more senior is helping to do some of these swaps. So when folks around you, and it's important with these swaps to not just do it for yourself, but to encourage those that are around you to realize that this way of thinking is the correct way of thinking, right? That if you're going to build that triangle the way that you want everybody to have it, that they all need to see the same triangle as you see. And if you're seeing the wrong one, then someone's got to figure it out. And the only way you're going to figure it out is you get onto the same page. And so when someone says, we never write the documentation before we write the application, right? We don't even know what it's supposed to do and we start writing it. Well, how can we start? How can we write the documentation ahead? You need to ask, how can you get ahead of that problem? How can you start to solve it? Because if you allow yourself to say, we never, these kinds of absolute terms, these fully qualifying terms that just sweep over everything, this is actually a term that's used for despair. Listen to someone speaking. When they say never, always, usually followed by emotion, right? You always leave the seat up in the bathroom and I end up falling in. Like, well, that's probably not true. Probably it only happened a couple times, but you know, it's unpleasant. So that's what I'm getting is the emotion, right? So the next one that I'm mentioning might be a little vague here, but what I'm referring to here with the cube life, it's easy for us when we're solving these problems to only want to stay in the fun part, which is the problem solving part. And to say, okay, well, just send me another problem. I'll stay in my cube. I'll fix the problem. I encourage you, as much as you possibly can, get introduced to someone who can give you the information on the problem. Go out of the cube, go meet the people who are going to be affected by the value you create. See them, learn their names, like whatever it is that you need to do. Don't just stay in your cube and only learn your own, whatever was given to you. I actually was interviewing a candidate, and he gave me a phrase that he was aware of that I'd never heard before, but I think is very valuable. I was expressing some interest to him in having a collaborator, somebody that would work seeking out how to solve a problem space, right? And when I got done explaining what I was looking for, he said that he had heard that it said that there's only two really truly useless people in the world. Those who will not do anything no matter what you ask them. And those who only do exactly what you ask them, right? And that's not either of the categories you're trying to be in when you want to be a senior, right? You want to pick a problem space, you want to seek out the answers to whatever it is that you're trying to solve. And sometimes that means you got to go find the people who are related to where the value comes from, and understanding that on your own. And sometimes I've seen folks, they get the requirements or get a project or get asked to do something, and they have no idea how to even start, right? Or sometimes you'll be in a meeting, and in the meeting, you'll have everybody in there, and there's not one person who seems to have a clear answer. Like everybody's confused and nobody else has a question. And how I've learned to try to work through this is I start by proposing a solution. The reason why I do this, even if the solution is wrong, is it gets people thinking about solving the problem, not just asking lots of more questions that have no real action around it. If any of you are interested in doing like board meetings or some kind of like meetings as a group, one of the things that tends to happen is people discuss all day long, and then they don't have any actions that come out of the meeting. What was the real fruit, right? There are books where they have meeting rules, and one popular one that's fairly popular in a fair number of groups in this area is Robert's Rule of Order. And one of the things about this is that when you go through the rules, it's very clear. You're not supposed to actually just sit around and discuss. You start with a proposal to take action, because action is going to be what delivers value. And so you say, I propose we do this. Maybe the answer is you don't, but at least you made a direction, a push to create value. And if that turns out not to be the answer, then the next thing that comes up hopefully will be someone else doing the same thing. I propose we do this, right? And somewhere along the line, if your team is actually getting along, you'll get the right one that's going to work, and then you'll pick it and you'll start taking that forward and making progress. And I encourage you to make swaps of your own. Like find other things that you see. There's going to be a lot of them.
What do we do when you're new data like retro? There's so many people in the room, and it's just harder to make it feel like everyone's feeling included, or like, is there like, should a bigger team be split into two smaller teams maybe to make the discussions more effective and the action more effective that comes out of the discussions?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So retrospectives have this uncanny ability to just devolve into a bunch of people just sitting around like arguing or complaining about things, right? And so what you want to do is you want to frame it in a way that helps to draw it forward, right? How can we get value from a retrospective? Well, retrospective gives you value because you saw something that didn't go well, and you hope to make a change for something in the future of something that's actionable, right? And so it doesn't always seem pleasant to be the person who's breaking them out of the mold, but somebody, could be you at the next one, where you need to have someone bring forward that we need to get action out of what we're doing. And so I hear that someone's got a complaint, they didn't like it, but if, let's say the problem that they're complaining about is going away anyway, like it's a one-off, or maybe it was time limited, maybe it was a bad client that the company canceled the contract with. I mean, maybe that can be a recommendation to the folks who line up the projects to do better next time, but continuing to talk about it is not really netting any fruit.
in the retrospective, they have a retrospective thing, that tool that you can use where you can list things that didn't go right and also talk about how you can improve them. And I think if a lot of developers took that seriously and you do it 5 minutes before retrospective, then it can be a very useful tool in terms of getting the plan of action for the next sprint.
That's a good point. So
we use a similar tooling and we make it available from the start of the sprint that people can go in. That way you're doing it as soon as you identify those issues, right? And you're not spending a lot of that meeting time normal whiteboarding out what you're saying. That can all be done ahead of time. Everyone can get a chance as they have time to review it before the retrospective. And then that allows you to spend much of that time in the retrospective coming up with action items, solve those problems. There are really problems in that just the fight.
So one of the problems that I have with retrospectives, to the point of nobody likes to prepare for it, right? And it's because, frankly, you got a lot of other stuff that's pressuring you to get done. So what I usually do is I started asking myself, what is the minimum amount of preparation that actually creates value from a retrospective? And so I created, based on other teams that I worked on, actually, a very simple frame that I use when I go to meetings. First of all, whoever is one of the fastest typers, you have that person at the keyboard doing the presentation. And then you have just a few headings that get filled in. And if someone's out of order, you ask them to bring it into order. So the first question, in the case that it's the second retrospective and onwards from when you're doing this format, is actions from last retro. And hopefully this is easy, because if you typed it out, you basically paste from what you said last time of what actions you wanted to take. You paste that here, and then you just make a quick statement of whether or not you did it, or you're not doing it, or you're gonna give up on it, or what, right? But that's the only ones you're going to go through during this section, is what did we say you were going to do last time and what actually got done. And I found that this idea kind of keeps people on track and gets them going in the right way, and helps people to see whether or not they're actually making progress on trying to change things they didn't like, and bring that forward a little bit. And so the next thing I try to do is usually not what do we want to do better, or what we failed at, or all that kind of stuff. Usually I prefer not to have it just be a complaining meeting. So I usually, what went well? Let people, get it out there, what's going on, that's good. That rephrasing it like that certainly could be a lot more helpful to folks that are struggling with that. If you are looking for a different phrasing, I think the team that I'm on, what we've been doing is what can we improve, I think was the phrasing. It was something like that. And then this I specifically kept separate from what are the actions for next time. And that was the last one. Is like, what is our actions for next time? And then after that, if people want to go back to like, what can we improve when you're already doing actions? Like you need to have forward progress. So, great to bring it up. Let's talk about it in the next retro or whatever. And sometimes you just have to cut it off and draw it forward, because the reality is that if your team agrees on what the value, who's receiving the value that you're creating, having a 2-hour retro instead of a 1 hour, you're not getting it. You're losing that value. You're trading it for the wrong thing, right? And so I have a few cautionary tales. So this first one was kind of one of the spots in my life where it helped me to frame what I do. And I was a teenager. I was at home. I didn't have I had a paper route, I think, at one point. But I didn't have much money, and I had chores that I was expected to do. I don't know if kids still do kids still have chores?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one of my chores was sometimes to be doing painting jobs. I didn't especially like painting. And my stepfather had said he wanted all the cabinets redone. And I thought he was being cheap because I would have liked to help him install like hardwood, like oak cabinets. I would have thought that was cool. But what he was doing is he's doing a faux finish. And so he was putting a base coat on, and then you put like the fake, the grain in it, and then you have to do the little with the rubber where you pull it across, and it kind of creates a grain look on it. I wasn't digging it. I didn't feel good about doing it. And so one time I'm sitting there, I'm doing the cabinets in the bathroom, and he comes by, and he can tell like by the way I'm applying myself at that job. He said, "Son, don't you have any pride in your work?" And then he walked away. That was very impactful. It made me realize all at once he was saying, you suck because your work sucks because you won't invest yourself in what you're doing, right? You don't want to wait for the opportunity to do something important before you start to care. You want to start doing an excellent job right away. Yeah. And so that wasn't my proudest moment, but I was glad that I had that lesson. And later I brought it up to him. He didn't even remember. It was like no big lesson for him. It was just like, he was just walking by. So another one that I want to bring up, go ahead.
I had an experience where, documentation is probably one of the things that most developers they do because part of their job.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy documentation because I often feel like if somebody looks at my documentation, they should be coming to me to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because that means I do a good job. But the problem I have is a lot of times you will put in your time and commitment and the soul into doing something, and some other developer does not like it because you use this word and they start being extremely picky to a point where it does not even necessarily add value, but they just want things done their certain way, not necessarily whether what you've done accomplishes, the task. And so I don't know, how to go around something like that, where people feel like it has to be, especially when it comes to things that are written, a lot of them are subjective, and so you get people who want things done a certain way. If they're not done a certain way, their way, they lose their mind.
No, I think that's a good question. So it takes all types to do software development, and it's actually why I chose not to be a manager. I was like, I'd rather be like a senior level contributor rather than a manager. It's like dealing with people is very hard. But one of the things that I found as a helpful tool when I have these kinds of disagreements is that sometimes it's about the understanding of where it is that your work and their work meet, right? And what I've used in those cases is I use, just like in the meeting where I say, I propose that we do something, I would see if you could get them to do it. I propose this, right? And then when they do it, if they can do it like in the system, I don't know what kind of system you're using to do your documentation in, but if your documentation system allows for comments or allows for feedback, or like in the way that source code has pull requests or things like that, if you can get them to propose the change, and ideally in a way that you can just click to accept, but in some cases the change will be inappropriate, right, for a particular reason, that you can reply with the answer of whether or not you agree or don't agree. And the reason why is that it gets people to step back from kind of the emotion of like disagreeing about it, but then to talk about what it is they're trying to get. And I'm hoping that from hearing what you're saying is that by getting on the same page of what the value is that you're trying to do, that you can get what you're looking for. And in some cases where they're kind of going on for a long time about something they really disagree with, it might be helpful to remind them where the real value comes from. It's not just this one word, it's the aggregate, right? And so unless this is taking away from the aggregate, it might be better to propose this as kind of a more, like a more general change later as a group, rather than being stuck and not able to continue, right? This is why actually, I showed you in here, I just type it into Notepad. And the reason why I type it into something like Notepad or some very simple text editor is because I don't want something squiggling or getting in my way or all this other kind of stuff distracting me from what I'm trying to get done, which is like, just put the information in, I'll go back in and I'll fix it later. Like, I don't need to have everything so perfect. Like when everybody's in the room, why do 8 people have to watch me fix a typo, right? That costs the company money. That costs us loss of value, right? So don't do it. And so if you can get the person on the same page for that, it's like, how can we make the most value? Then maybe you might have luck kind of fixing that situation. So this next one is a short tale on the mobile team selection. And it kind of goes to the statement of quality. So I worked for a company that did point of care software for clinicians. And when we worked there, they had a fair number of software developers, but they were working on a system that was written for Windows desktop application. And then they had a web application. A lot of it had like COM and, all of that stuff. And if you've ever done any work in that, it's like, it's a nightmare. Like, don't do it. And the software needed a big upgrade. And so they had this idea that they were going to put it on an iPad, because iPad was new and it was easy and it's a fairly cheap computer. It's attractive. You can get it with a radio antenna to talk to cell towers, get mobile internet like in a lot of places. And so what they wanted to do with this mobile team was to build a group of folks to kind of get this new project going. Well, because the old software was not built to a quality that allowed them to hand it off to new people easily, what ended up happening is that the folks who were working on that project were basically corralled to stay on that old project, while new people who came into the company got the new project, right? Well, I don't know about you, but if I worked at a company and I worked there for 6, 8 years, I might like to work on the new stuff, right? Not like keep working on the old stuff. And then as far as it goes, like on your resume, what's going to be more beneficial? I worked on stuff that was cool and hip 12 years ago, or I worked on stuff that's cool and hip now, right? So from a career perspective, they were really losing out. And the reason why they were losing out was because they didn't build into what it meant to build that triangle, the component of how to build it to a quality that someone with a lesser skill or experience could easily work on it. And so the perception was the smallest cost to the company is to keep them there on those projects. And so for your own sake, that's a cautionary tale to make sure that you are aware of this, that when you're working in a place, that you build a little bit of a factor in, that your software is easy enough to understand, whether that means readmes, whether it means simplifying the stack, whether it means making like helper scripts that go in your repository that you run. Unit tests, yes, unit tests, 100%. Build automation, if you have build agents, automatically doing builds in compilation, like every time you have a gotcha and you're like, oh, I just needed to remember, like make something so you don't have to remember, and that will start to reduce that. I mean, I benefited, but they didn't. And I knew one guy who left the company basically over this, is because not that he was mad, but that it made him realize like that he's not able to advance his career. And so he ended up having to look for another place. And this last one is point of care upgrades. And I'll try to keep this one short, but when that same company, when I was on the mobile team, one of the things that I knew is that there was no way we were going to get it right in one version. Just was not going to happen. So the old product, when it was upgraded, they had this data syncing software, and the data syncing software would basically take this big database that had like all this data for all of their customers, and then it would figure out like which customer or patients you needed on your specific laptop, and then it did this like interesting exchange of data, and they would ship it over, and it would run it like transactions on your computer and all that. And this software was actually kind of brittle, and if it didn't work, what ended up happening is the clinician, if something really went haywire, the clinician basically had to say, you know what, I can't figure it out, it's messed up, I need to have someone from support fix it. And when they fixed it, it took an hour and a half. They basically more or less re-imaged the machine and just started over and put all the stuff back on it and then synchronized all the data. What that meant is that computer was basically out of commission for the rest of the day, right? Well, a lot of these places didn't have just extra spare computers just because, right? So this might have taken someone's day, and now they've got to write it all down on paper. And then when they get home, when they'd rather be spending time with their kids and their family, they're typing stuff into the computer that should have been able to be typed in while they were at the place where the client was. And so what we decided to do with the new product, and I pushed pretty hard for it, is that we would make it so that it had seamless upgrades. And so worst case, if you had to upgrade, just like on a normal iPad app, you long press it, you hit the little X, it would delete it, and then you could download it from the store again. You log in, 10 minutes later, you're already back up and running. I mean, it was that kind of speed. And the reason why I pushed to put in that level of, I guess, design into our upgrade system and the data syncing was because I saw how painful it was for the customers that were already there. And so if there's pain points that you have for your existing customers, I would encourage you to also think about like, how can we take existing pain points like that and make it so that, you know, they're not up late at night transcribing stuff from paper back into the computer because my software went haywire. So I don't know if there's much time for questions, but thank you. So I worked for, a company that did website search engine optimization, that kind of stuff for a while. And then I worked for a company that did manufacturing. They actually did stuff for like speakers, things like that. They did drive remanufacturing. And then I worked for the city of Los Angeles, doing contracting for the General Services Department. And then after that, I started working primarily something related to health or life sciences, yeah.
Any good resources for leadership? We didn't specifically call it out, but he was a senior principal. And that being authoritarian talk, where it's more technical.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody comes to questions and take leadership.
No, yeah, definitely.
It's not natural for a lot of times. Like, I'm very introverted, so I don't have a natural leadership ability. That's something I want to at least come at it with that. Yeah,
so I don't know if you would believe this, but when I first got into computer programming, it was very frequent that I would be speaking, I would get too excited, and then I wouldn't be able to speak. I wouldn't even be able to finish a sentence. And so I would say to fix that, a lot of it is just practice. Slow down, be intentional, think about what it is that you want, what it is you're trying to get, and just realize that really everybody wants you to succeed at what you're trying to do. And with the leadership, a lot of it is, what I've taken is not trying to lead people by pulling if I can avoid it, but to lead people by example if I can. So it's like, I want you to do something, but I'm going to try to get you to do it because I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, and then every time you don't do it, I'm going to show you how it's done again. And then that's kind of the approach that I've been trying to take. And it works in some cases. It doesn't always work in others. Yeah.